I'm Susan Steele Mulholland, and welcome to this edition of Art Beat. Today we are at the James Michener Art Museum for the current exhibit on photography. And next we'll go to Newtown, Pennsylvania and visit the home of one of the exhibiting photographers, Emmett Gowan. But first, I'll be joined by the curator of this show, Brian P. It's nice to be here today.
Thank you for coming.
Brian, would you tell our viewers what job it is of yours as curator of the show?
Well, Susan, in the larger sense, the curator could be called a kind of middleman in the art world. In other words, if you think of art making as you have artists out there in their studios and out in the world making things, and then you have the viewing public who wants to see what the artist is doing. And the curator serves as a kind of gatekeeper in a certain sense, or someone whose job it is to maintain an overview of what's going on in a given field. And the curator does is sort of say, well, gee, there seems to be this trend or that trend or another trend going on, and perhaps we can put together a show that would demonstrate or educate to the viewing public something that's going on in photography. So in terms of this particular exhibition at the Michener Museum, it's entitled Changing Visions of the American Landscape. In the simplest sense, what this show does is compare and contrast two both different and similar visions of American landscape photography and of the American landscape itself.
Let's go look at it.
Okay. Now, Susan, the traditional approach to the American landscape is masterfully exemplified by the photographer Ansel Adams. I think, as you're aware, anyone who's had any contact at all with photography has got to Adams. He's arguably the most famous ever, I suppose, and famous American photographer. Photographers, in fact, affectionately refer to him as Saint Ansel of Yosemite, which perhaps would be a term of endearment. But at any rate, Adams's approach to the American landscape through his photographs was, if you could sum it up in a word, I suppose it would be spiritual. Adams experienced and believed in the wilderness as something sublime, something pure, a place where Bruce Katzeff, the director of the museum, describes Adams's photographs as you feel that God is hiding behind every rock, you know. And Adams grew up and as a young man was actually trained as a classical pianist. But in his spare time, as a teenager, he would go to Yosemite Park with a little Kodak Brownie box camera, and he made his first photographs of Yosemite Park with this little bitty. In other words, he fell in love with the place. And then later in his 20s, when he decided to be a musician anymore, it was perfectly natural then for him to go to the place that he loved, which was the mountains of California, like the Sierra Nevadas, Yosemite Park, and photograph in such a way that he would try and communicate to people his basic experience of the kind of spirituality of nature. So Adams then very much exemplifies this traditional approach to landscape photography, which in this show is also represented by artists like Edward Weston and the 19th century photographer Carlton Watkins.
Brian and I continued our quest of viewing the historic development of landscape photography as exhibited in this show at the Michener.
So if Ansel Adams represents a more pure or spiritual view of nature, these younger photographers that we're looking at now, when I say younger, most of them are actually still alive, which is, I guess, would define young. These photographers see nature in a very different way. Although, interestingly enough, I think their motivation, their love of nature, let's say, is similar to Ansel Adams and the other photographers, but they go about it differently. Just exemplified by a brief story about the other Adams in the show, a photographer named Robert Adams, who's no relation to Ansel Adams, but Robert Adams in the Denver area in the 40s and 50s, 1940s and 50s, at a time when Denver is populated as it is now, and as a boy, his father to roam through the mountains and pathways and byways of the natural areas around Denver. Now, he went away to go to school And when he came back, he discovered to his horror, really, that all of these places that he fell in love with, in a sense, were destroyed. Now, in this sense, it was kind of similar to Ansel Adams, because Ansel Adams fell in love with Yosemite Park and used that as his motivation to photograph. Robert Adams kind of did the same thing. As he worded it in one of his writings that I've read, when he came back to Denver, he said to himself, how do I survive this? You know, in other words, he anger, outrage, sadness over what had been done. And what he did was like Ansel Adams, energy coming from the love of nature and put it in his photographs, but he did it in a very different way. Whereas Ansel Adams and the other traditional photographers who idealize and in a sense almost even romanticize nature, Robert Adams, Len Jenshel, John Fall, Israq, Margot Balboni, the other photographers in the younger show, they show nature what it looks like in all of its glory and also all of its, you might say. So in their photographs you see all kinds of evidence of human contact and even human destruction in the context of nature. So you see billboards, you see roads, you see signs, you see telephone poles, and you see graffiti even. And these photographers, as I said, a similar love of nature, but it's just they're living in a different, they're living in an age when a lot more damage has been done. And so their response to that is to, I suppose in a way you could say, to kind of rub our noses a little bit in what we as a species have done to the world we were given, in a sense. And this photographer here that we're looking at, Len Jenshel, in a summarizes or epitomizes, you might say, this newer form of landscape photography. Jenshel in this photograph put his camera in a place which is probably the most photographed place on the American continent. We may not realize that, but this is Monument Valley in Utah. And if we could count the number of car commercials and grade B movies, westerns, that were made in Monument Valley, it would number in the hundreds, I'm sure. So Monument Valley has come to, almost like the Grand Canyon or other famous natural places, has come to symbolize the American wilderness, okay? Now what Jenshel did was, rather than idealize it the way Ansel Adams and his followers did, Jenshel literally in the parking lot of a motel or a lodge, and in the background we can see the spires, the famous spires, the Mittens in Valley, but in the foreground we see two brightly colored orange traffic control cones. Yeah, and he's drawing a kind of a visual, the point of the cones, but and the spires. But in a larger sense, I suppose you could almost call it dark humor or gallows humor or something. He wants us to laugh, say, isn't that funny? These funny traffic control cones, and what are they doing there? But then he also wants us to step back for a minute and think and say, well, gee whiz, this is really what it looks like out there now, isn't it?
That's the way I feel about this one over here.
About John Fall?
Yes.
Well, why don't we go over and take a look?
Right.
Okay. So Susan, I mentioned in the context of the Lenjef of Monument Valley, the idea of, you might say, biting or revealing humor. And that element is also present in the work of this photographer, John Fall. That's spelled P-F with a P in the German sense, P-F-A-H-L. But at any rate, this is a photograph of a place like, perhaps even more famous than Monument Valley. This is the Grand Canyon. And we can all think of the hundreds of photographs that we've seen of the Grand Canyon over the years, and generally there are rainbows and vistas and dark clouds in the background, and you see nature in a very romanticized sense, in a way, in a certain sense that we were talking about with Ansel Adams. But John Fall, in this series, which he calls Picture Windows, has photographed the Grand Canyon, but he placed his camera inside of a visitor center. So we're seeing the Grand Canyon, but these two things are the columns, in a sense, in the visitor center, and we're seeing this nice sort of typical American tourist couple sitting there quaintly, sort of in American Gothic fashion, I guess you could say, surveying the landscape. Well, in fact, you know, this is really, and so all John Fall is doing, in a way, is drawing our attention to the fact that, yes, the ideal, you know, more romanticized view of the Grand Canyon exists. There it is, but we've also there, and can we really afford, in a certain sense, to deny the fact that there are people here as well?
And he
That's
does
sort of the
this
point.
over here, doesn't he?
Yes, yeah, let's look at this one here. Now, in the case of the canyon photograph, what John Fall is doing is playing off of or drawing our attention to what you might call an icon or a great wonder of the American landscape, the Grand Canyon, and then photographing it in an unusual way. In this case, with this photograph, what Fall is referring to or playing off of is a type or even a cliche of photography itself. And what I'm talking about here is the sunset photograph. Think of all the photographs that you've seen of sunsets. They're beautiful, they're colorful, all of the sort of romantic feelings that we have about nature. And if you look at this photograph from a distance, you will say, oh, what a lovely, beautiful color sunset. Of course, then when you get closer, you discover that these two objects here, which in front of the sun, no, they're not mountains or hills, they're cooling towers for a nuclear power plant. And so again, Fall is in a sense refusing to let us idealize or romanticize nature. He's, as I said before, sort of rubbing our nose in the fact that, well, this is what's really there. For better or worse, like it or not, these places exist. And I suppose he's saying that it would behoove us to remember that. And I guess in one sense you could say that's the point of the show.
I left Brian at the museum and traveled to Pennsylvania to the home of Emmett Gowan, a featured photographer in the show, who teaches at nearby Princeton University. Emmett, we have just been at the Michener and have seen some landscape exhibit. But I've been looking at this beautiful book of yours, and you started with family pictures back in the 60s, which I think you feel has led to where you are now. That how you got into photography and how this feeling of family has gone from where it did to landscape photography.
Well, I think photography found me. I don't really think I found it. That may not be saying much, but I had a brief encounter with photography, saw an amazing picture, thought it had a significance that I had never attributed to pictures, went out and duplicated as closely as I could that picture and put my camera away. I never make pictures again. And I was in business school after high school for a couple of years, and the tension of being in the wrong place and you're about to ruin your life brings a kind of translucency to your thinking, and then I got a little straight. I had met the woman that I married by that time, and to her family, and the introduction to photography as something that I could actually work at more than just replicate that one example. It came at the same time. I went off to art school, and they said, you have to take photography. And some of the friends that I was with then said, oh, it's a terrible thing, photography. It's not good for anything. And I thought, that's very limited. That's very short-sighted. I think it's possible that something very poetic about photography. And I still believe that. I believe that photography works both as a kind of evidence of realness and as an imaginative vehicle. When I started, I just started to photograph what was really accessible to me. And Edith, who I married 3 years later, and her were accessible. That's where my interests were, and I think I was just trying to learn how to be an adult. You know, not oversimplifying, but I would look at the children and I'd realize, just as I do when I look at my own students today, I realize their empathies, their understanding so strongly to childhood. They just have emerged from it themselves. It's no wonder they think of photographing children, and that's what I did. And the children, and I had some wonderful old people, and And it's not surprising to me that the young are interested in the very young and the old, because that represents a kind of an image of how life is connected, and that's something you're not. You're not a baby anymore, and you're not old. And you can hardly imagine ever being old, and you can hardly relate to being a child. Looking back, I can see that I wanted to photograph children, but they were very comfortable to me. But I think deeper mysteries were involved with what was child, where children come from, how they grow, how they become adults. And you may make the study as if it were theoretical, but in fact it's very close to your heart. You're trying to learn how to live.
Emmett, when did you begin to take yourself seriously as a photographer? You know that this was going to be what you were going to be doing for your life?
You know, I think when I heard my fellow students say that photography is not very good for anything, I think right then I thought, I'm really a photographer. Because imaginatively I had a place in me that said, this is really powerful. You know, to take it lightly just didn't synchronize with my feelings at all. I'm not surprised that people would read, but I was convinced it had tremendous power. I worked for about 4 years in the style of Cartier-Bresson and Robert Frank, in a kind of Third Street photography or repertorial documentary style. And those pictures gradually became good. And there was a moment where I realized I couldn't continue to make those pictures because it was simply a repetition of something that, though I loved it very much, those pictures could have disappeared into the work of either of those photographers, and no one would have been the wiser. They were the same pictures. And a little light says, you can't do that anymore. And I went for several months very uncertain as to what to do. And I seemed to have emerged from that knowing that if you traveled, surfaced the earth as far as you could go, you would end up exactly back where you started. And that was a clue that the rarest thing might in fact be local, something that you knew all along. And the pictures had begun to come little by little. I'd always wanted to photograph Edith out of just the ordinary affection of putting someone in front of you and just beholding them. Blake says the most sublime act is to set another before you. Without his clue, I must have felt that's really something to consider someone's aliveness, just to look at it. So, and a few of the pictures began to look good. I think when I went off to study with Callahan in '60, and I got hold of a view camera, that made a difference, the biggest difference for me, because then the camera is static, everybody knows what's going on, you're all building to the moment when the picture's taken. It's a sequence of events, and the presence is, it's as if the person who's sitting to the camera is really in a dialogue with the mechanical thing itself, not so much a metaphysical transaction, but simple and physical and direct. The camera sees me. I'm allowing the camera to look at me. And that simplified the whole procedure. It meant that no meanings had to come, the evidence of what things look like. It didn't have to imply anything extra. All of the depth out of the surfaces. That's interesting.
Emmett, how did these earlier photographs then lead into what you're doing now?
Where you begin is in a sense where you'll end up. As it's part of your metaphorical makeup. We're at the mercy of what we find. The child came up to me. She drew me into her concerns. And in a landscape from an airplane, I'm in the same way at the mercy of the landscape that I was at the mercy of the child and the whim of the child and the invention of the child, the openness of the child. I can't draw someone into my concerns if they don't trust me. So I can arrange something only with faith of a collective construction we are going to build something. And if I needed to learn it, I certainly learned it in a hurry when I finally got in an airplane. I had wanted to photograph Mount St. Helens in 1980. And flying above the landscape, I quickly realized it was no good saying to the pilot, well, we need to be 500 feet lower, and then in a moment we need to be 500 feet higher. Because the ground, is shaped like this. You're very far away from the ground, and it's changing so rapidly. It was exactly what I intuitively knew, is that you can't manipulate anything. Nature, life is too much in control. Chaos governs. Chaos creates. And just go along for the ride. You relax. And you accept that certain configurations are available now, and a little later other configurations will be available. And that's in a way what's at stake. Where does the imagination come into the act of photography? That when a configuration is created, spatial, dimensional overlay, things comes into an alignment that it only exists in the photograph. A moment later, you move your head, the configuration collapses. It's a very different thing. That's one of the key things about photography, that it's a one-eyed vision that constructs a certain limited, very limited space. But the thing about it is that once the imagination gets hold of that space on a sheet of paper, in a print, is that the imagination begins to travel again, the surface of the picture. So, some people ask me, how did you switch out of the family? And I said, well, when I saw that they were all going to die, I realized my life couldn't be centered in just that one thing. Us too, but as the older people, as I had that attraction for the older people, they were my heroes and heroines, but I saw them die. We buried them. You're going to change. And about 72 or so, as my work began to be seen a little bit, I had come to Bucks County, I was teaching at the community college then, we really wanted to travel, and we went to Scotland and Ireland, which we felt some intuitive connection with, as some kind of ancestral connection. I don't really understand. I barely knew at the time that my grandmother was Irish. I know it now, but I didn't know it. Maybe it was the music that made me want to go there. And as soon as I was there, we were there 2 weeks in Ireland, and I found myself making landscapes. I had made landscapes around the house in Danville too, because if you love somebody, you have to see them in a context. And for them to blossom, use the metaphor of growth, the soil has to be right. The environment has to fit them. And so the landscape makes a great deal of sense. It's not some big abstract idea. It's where we are. It's where we occur within nature.
Emmett, I realize that a lot of photographers you are included delve mostly in black and white photography. Why is that? And then do you feel that developing your own photographs is also essential to your art?
Yes. Well, I would simply turn my negative over to another worker. Unless I train that worker, they wouldn't end up with the same print that I'm going to be getting. And I think that it's a very common perception of photography to think of it as a mechanical process. Actually, a great deal of modification can be done in the printmaking process. For example, I can take this print, even though it's been toned and washed, I can go back and bleach the print and remove half of the density of the print. That's a profound change, and it's not at all mechanical, and it's not a common process. It's not an approach that the commercial printer is going to make, and it's not going to know when to stop. Imaginative component. It's pretty obvious that there's an imaginative component in order to be able to perceive at all. I mean, perception is part of the process of the mind, and perception is what guides what we do. And that's what I'm, in the end, interested in, is perception, and educating my own perception.